Theodore left the board buttoning up his suit. He left behind Professor Gemini, who had fallen from shock. The other professors filled him with difficult tasks, wanting to test his abilities, but they all began to sweat and worry about his success. Soon rumors of the fact that Theodore got the perfect combination of full moon pills scattered throughout the academy. Some professors were shocked by his results and opened their mouths in bewilderment, because they gave tests a little more advanced than those that they were taught. But even when he was given the task of taming a monster, he coped with it. He managed to complete all the tests with ease. During the current semester, Theodore managed to try out all types of magic, and now we have seen how he raised his hand and tried to use fire magic, in which before he had only practical knowledge. Various tests stimulated the growth of magical power. Theodore managed to get out on the 4th round, passing the 3rd. Theodore frowned. His sensitivity to mana was still mediocre, but the difference in magical skills between Theodore and his fellow students was huge. Professor Vince, in the presence of other shocked professors, praised him for his increased strength. 2 first-year girls were discussing Theodore. One had pink hair and a pink uniform, and the other was blonde and wore an academy uniform. The opinion of those around Theodore changed dramatically. Although there were also more ill-wishers, the bullies of his class could not understand such a rapid increase in his strength and discussed this incident among themselves. Hershey Carter held his chin and thought. The fat man next to him was angry, and the girl squeezed out a tear. One of Crater's friends, who was sitting on the steps, asked him if Theodore had beaten his younger brother, and then continued talking and told him that because of this, those who wanted the bullying has decreased significantly. Garcia smiled, confirming his conclusions. Garcia stood in front of the speaker. A figure of a red predatory animal appeared behind him, which frightened the guy who was sitting. Garcia told how because of Theodore, members of his family walk with their heads bowed. The guy with a short haircut grinningly asked Garcia about a way to get even with Theodore. Garcia smiled at his words, because there really was one opportunity to beat him. Garcia's smile widened. He was going to beat Theodore at the magic battle tomorrow. Vince, holding a chalk in his hand, wrote on the board, talking about the reason for the importance of the subject of magic battles. He turned to the audience telling about the reason. It was all due to the fact that war always came at unexpected moments, and the need for magicians and their colossal power was becoming greater. But the number of magicians was still small, and as a result, all nations sponsored the government to develop and maintain educational institutions, all for the sake of educating battle magicians. Vince was wearing his red glasses and gave an analogy with a veteran soldier who could kill 10 people, and a magician of the 4th circle could kill 100. The professor put his hands in his pockets and continued to explain, saying that a magician on the battlefield was a powerful strategic weapon, but still few of the candidates will be able to fulfill the necessary requirements to qualify. Looking at the students, most of whom were shocked by his words, some opened their mouths in shock, and one even grabbed his head. Vince said that at least all of them they listened attentively, but he did not know which of them was worthy of the opportunity to become a battle mage. Vince looked up and talked about the possibilities if one of them became a battle mage. The army supplied the battle mage at the highest level, and the king himself gave a special title. The professor closed his eyes and just listened to the audience. After a second, the professor pointed his hand at the words he had written, explaining that even in their peaceful post-war days, there was a necessary evil, so the teacher asked to remember the career guidance that the country provides before the competition. Raising his finger up, Vince shouted, starting to explain them rules. Looking at his classmates handing over magical items, he forbade them. Vince raised a second finger, forbidding anyone to attack until the match was announced. He raised a third finger, saying the last prohibition about the impossibility of changing the order of the match. Vince looked seriously at the audience and began to warn them. His mouth opened wide with a scream. He announced that he would personally throw out anyone who violated at least one of the rules. Garcia, throwing his hands behind his head, smiled hearing his words. Theodore, closing his eyes, rubbed his hands. Vince threw his hands behind his back, listening to the students scream about their readiness. The professor bowed his head looking at the notebook he raised. He was happy with the students' attitude. Vince smiled. He announced the beginning of the first training match. The professor adjusted his glasses with his hand, and with the other he raised the notebook enough to see the words on it. Vince warned the students they could refuse even if their name was called, but no one guaranteed them a successful submission. Opening his mouth, the professor began to announce the contenders for the first fight. Garcia Carter was the first to beat. Garcia slammed his fist on the table and began to understand. Garcia, with his hands in his pockets, headed down the stairs. Reading the second participant, Vince's mood fell. It was Theodore. Vince's smile finally disappeared. Theodore raised his hand, not paying attention to Garcia's question about his brother. Theodore walked down the stairs opposite Garcia as he descended. The two of them stood opposite each other. Garcia's hands were in his pockets. The mana around Garcia glowed. He looked at Theodore, noticing the too pretty face. With one hand, Garcia rested on his side. His smile did not disappear from his face. At this time, the mana glowed brightly around him. Theodore looked at Garcia with an indifferent look. Garcia raised his hand and lightning began to appear in it, his hair standing on end due to the current. He asked Theodore about his status as one of the worst students. But Theodore did not answer and simply raised his hand and made an inviting gesture, beckoning Garcia to come over. Theodore did not take his eyes off Garcia, and in his thoughts, accusing him of being stupid. Vince intervened in Garcia's fight, writing with a pen on a notepad. He advised Garcia to save his strength for the upcoming battle if he did not want to fly out. Vince stood between Garcia and Theodore. He looked at Theodore, saying that the purpose of the training was to get acquainted with offensive and defensive maneuvers. Ordinary fights are unacceptable and his classes are only in an educational context. Vince asked to respect the rules of magical battles, follow them in his classes, and also gain experience in offensive and defensive positions. Theodore rolled up his sleeves and clenched the fist of his left hand, palm right hand. He did not stop looking at Garcia. Garcia looked at Theodore with his hands in his pockets with a smile on his face. Vince explained that once the coin touched the ground they would be allowed to use spells. The professor took out the coin and placed it on his hand, preparing to toss it. Vince looked at the coin tossed by his thumb. The coin was spinning tirelessly in flight. When the coin was still in the air and a drawing of a man with a wreath on his head appeared, Vince ordered Theodore to get ready. Theodore extended both arms and stood in a stance. When the coin showed a 1 with a divided with a wreath, the professor ordered Garcia to get ready to begin the attack. Garcia took his hands out of his pockets and stood in a stance. Covering the hand on which the coin was with another, Vince, with a gloom in his voice, prepared to begin the fight. As soon as he removed his palm from the coin and the number appeared, he ordered to begin duel. Garcia, standing in a stance, immediately cast a lightning spell and directed it at Theodore. Theodore, crossing his arms, cast a barrier spell. A yellow barrier instantly formed around him and stopped the lightning. The barrier cracked and shattered. Theodore's figure was visible in the gap in the barrier. Theodore, around him faint steam came out, looked at Garcia and made conclusions. He used the fastest lightning technique to ensure victory. Except for the lightning strike, Garcia's shield power is unparalleled in the class. Theodore raised his hand and clenched it into a fist. Before he thought that he would not be able to use simple magic, and now seriously hoped for victory. A deceptive maneuver could help Theodore, while Garcia was underestimating him. Theodore's eyebrows furrowed, his gaze became furious. He wanted Garcia to continue to think the same way and not take him seriously. His defeat would then be a foregone conclusion. Garcia, he used his hands to push away the smoke around him, reminding everyone that the worst students in the first classes usually get injured. Theodore raised his hand again, calling out to Garcia. He asked for forgiveness because Garcia had not won yet and he should have waited a little. Garcia looked at Theodore. He was angry and did not understand how Theodore was able to stop his attack. Theodore stood in a stance and directed a spell at him with his hand. Twisting spears of red color formed behind Theodore. Theodore pursed his lips and clenched his fists. He squinted at Garcia. The fire strike spell was sent towards Garcia, striking him. Garcia raised his hand and activated a barrier spell. A golden barrier formed around him. He chuckled at Theodore's attempt to break through his barrier. Garcia's eye narrowed in irritation. In his thoughts, Theodore would never repeat such a spell next time, and the gap between them would become even greater. But suddenly, cracks spread across his barrier. Theodore's spell broke through Garcia's barrier. Garcia was angry at Theodore's decision to focus all the fire strikes at one point to break through his barrier. Garcia opened his eyes wide, looking at the cracks spreading across his barrier. The full power of the fire spell was concentrated on the top of Garcia's barrier. Garcia's barrier was destroyed, and Garcia himself was sent flying. Garcia crossed in flight, hands covering his face from the explosion. Garcia looked at Theodore in shock. His barrier had been broken and now Garcia did not understand how to protect himself from Theodore's spell. Garcia looked between his crossed arms at Theodore in the distance, not understanding how he used the spell like that. He looked at his enemy and did not understand how Theodore was able to change the trajectory of the spell. Garcia's eyes narrowed as he looked at Theodore with fury. His lips curved into a strange smile and Garcia decided to confront Theodore seriously. Garcia clenched his fist, which began to glow red. It was difficult for him to control the spell, but as long as Garcia concentrated, he had the opportunity to win. Garcia's fist opened and bright flashes of flame came out of his palm. In the middle of his palm there was a bright light. Garcia decided to crush Theodore with the power. He prepared another fire spell that glowed in his hand and the mana emanating from it raised Garcia's hair. A red haze spread around him. Garcia swung his hand, which contained an ignition spell. He threw a fireball towards Theodore. The fireball was approaching Theodore, who crossed his arms. Theodore extended his hand and decided to use a triangular barrier. The triangular barrier began to form around Theodore. If the attack were to come from both sides of the triangular barrier, its power will decrease. The fire spell crashed into Theodore's triangular barrier and bounced off of it. Due to the smoke and the barrier, the result on the battlefield was not visible to others in the audience. Some students stood up and noticed someone coming out of the fog. Theodore was coming out of the fog. Coming out of the fog, he walked towards Garcia. Garcia was scared, his mouth opened, and his eyes bulged. He did not understand how Theodore could survive his spell. Theodore raised his head and informed Garcia about his turn. Theodore's hand began to turn red and steam was coming out of it. He clenched his fist, from which flashes of flame emanated. Garcia fell and began to crawl back in fear. He told him to give him time to recover. Theodore swung his hand in which he concentrated the fire spell. He extended his hand forward directing his spell at Garcia. The spell flew out and hit Garcia's body right through. Garcia's eyes rolled back and his mouth opened. Before losing consciousness, he asked himself in shock how Theodore broke through his barrier again. The spell hit Garcia's chest and his body flew in the opposite direction from Theodore. Vince looked at Garcia flying past him and crashing into the barrier. All the students in the audience were shocked. They saw how the young master of the Carter family, Garcia, was beaten by the runt Theodore. Theodore pounded his fist on his chest, rejoicing in victory. Many students stood up and began shouting Theodore's name in praise of him. At this time, Garcia was lying on the floor after Theodore's spells. He looked at the wall he crashed into, only now realizing that there was no point in protecting himself. Directing his furious gaze at Theodore, he blamed him for everything. Garcia began to get up and Vince, noticing this, turned his head and looked at him. Garcia, in a rage, he said that he would not accept defeat from a sudden attack, and even while he himself was without mana. Theodore crossed his arms and looked at Garcia, who had stood up. Garcia, hunched over and clutching the wound on his chest, challenged Theodore to a duel. Garcia quietly took out a magical object from his inner pocket jacket. Garcia wrinkled his long nose, furrowed his brows and bared his teeth, angrily demanding a repeat duel with Theodore in the name of the honor of the Carter family. A young man in a black suit pulled out a small red and yellow object from his bosom. Vince, with his hands folded in the pockets of his black coat, watched Garcia from afar. The professor, looking at Garcia through his round red glasses with confusion in his eyes, found it amusing that the man, immediately after an unexpected defeat, issued a second challenge. There was anger in Vince's eyes as he thought that the reputation of the Carter family would be beyond envy if rumors of Garcia's defeat at the hands of the protagonist spread. Vince looked at the desperation with which Garcia looked at the object in his palm and came to the conclusion that for him now this was not just a duel, the lust for murder was burning in his eyes, and his reputation was at stake. Vince frowned his thin black eyebrows and thought that now, for the sake of victory, Garcia does not disdain strengthening and artifacts, and that the professor can stop the fight and punish him. However, when Vince turned his gaze to Theodore, he realized that his eyes were burning with rage. The main character froze with a hostile expression on his face, raising both hands with his shirt sleeves rolled up. Then the main character clenched one palm into a fist, extended the other, and put both hands in front of him. Garcia suddenly screamed, fire-red claws of madness and eyes of the abyss engulfed in wrath. Garcia clenched his hand tightly into a fist, and bright rays of light leaked from it. An orange fiery aura appeared around the man. He bent over and pressed his hands to his chest, loudly ordering Theodore to appear in front of him now. The next moment, the outline of a huge animal appeared behind Garcia, whose clothes and hair had turned red. Theodore, covered in sweat, raised one eyebrow and said that Garcia had gone crazy. Garcia, whose hair and clothes were torn off in small pieces, screamed deafeningly, calling for transformation and a wave of explosive flames, a fiery embodiment. With hatred and his nose wrinkled with anger, Garcia loudly addressed the main character. While Garcia asked if Theodore could withstand his murderous attack, the protagonist watched his opponent with worry on his face. Theodore arched his eyebrows and calmly said that Garcia was being ridiculous. Garcia, his eyes white and veins standing out on his forehead, screamed shrilly for Theodore to stop pretending, because his barrier would not withstand the fiery incarnation, and demanded to surrender. The main character, arrogantly throwing back his head and closing one eye, asked how Garcia got such confidence that his opponent would not win and reproached him for using the artifact. Theodore grinned, arrogantly reminding him that Garcia was using all this against a student who was inferior to him in everything. Garcia, whose face had deep wrinkles, loudly insulted the main character and shouted that he would rant in the next world. Theodore replied in an even tone that he was wasting his time here, listening to his opponent's chatter. The main character poked his chest with his index finger and with confidence on his face told Garcia to attack him. Garcia, greatly amused by these words, chuckled and said with a wild smile that victory or defeat no longer mattered. Gathering concentrated flames in his hand, Garcia glared at the protagonist with hatred and declared that he did not care about punishment and would fry Theodore and clear his family's name. Garcia, screaming death wishes at the top of his lungs, clenched his fist and bared his teeth, revealing white teeth. The man hit his fist in front of him, and a powerful fiery attack immediately formed in the air, rushing towards the main character. The flames lit up the entire room, making it difficult to see anything. Theodore, who crossed his arms over his chest with clenched fists, closed his eyes and thought that Garcia correctly noted that the barrier would not be enough, for he used the magic of the fourth circle, fiery embodiment. Without opening his eyes, the main character thought that Garcia, however, had forgotten about the spontaneous nature of interactions, and it was his own fault for deciding that Theodore would erect one barrier. Theodore suddenly opened his dark gray eyes wide and furrowed his thin eyebrows. The main character sat down on one knee, touching the floor with his palm, and the earth immediately rose into the air around him. Theodore yelled loudly, creating an earthen barrier and a stone dome. Through the walls of the barrier, the main character saw Garcia's angry face. The fiery attack collided with the stone dome, and it shattered, and large fragments flew into the air. Many small flame attacks rushed towards the barrier, attacking one point on it. The space was filled with thick, dusty fog. Vince, whose silhouette was visible among the dust, watched the fight intently. A young man with dark hair and a girl with one braided braid looked at what was happening in horror. Looking at the destroyed stone barrier, they were angry with Theodore and said that he had paid with his life for having decided to mock. Garcia, wiping his chin, said with a grin that it was hellishly hot inside, regardless of whether the main character parried the blow or not. Garcia was just about to say that his family's reputation had been restored when suddenly his blue eyes widened in shock. A tightly clenched fist pushed through the piles of broken stones. Theodore, raising his hand above himself, with a raised eyebrow and curved lips, stood in the middle of the fragments of the stone barrier. The main character asked if Garcia slept in class because they studied the nature of the elements in the first year of study. Garcia's eyes nearly fell out of their sockets and his lower jaw fell off as he screamed in shock. Vince smirked and sighed softly, feeling disappointed in Garcia. The spectators of the fight looked at Theodore with shock frozen on their faces. Vince, whose clothes were blowing in the wind, announced the end of the fight. The man, his eyes burning with anger, approached Garcia and ordered him to stand up. Garcia looked at the professor with fear and tried to justify himself with a trembling voice. Garcia fell silent in fear as Vince roughly grabbed him by the shirt and lifted him off the ground. The professor, with an angry face, punched Garcia hard on the cheek and he flew to the side. Garcia fell to the floor, instinctively putting his hands to his face and raising his leg in self-defense. Garcia lay with his cheek on the floor and bled, weakly telling the professor that he could explain everything. Vince, who had a crazy smile on his face, silently picked up the wounded Garcia, missing several teeth, from the ground, roughly clenching his clothes in his fist. The professor angrily demanded that Garcia explain how he used the artifact in his class. Garcia looked at Vince in horror and, without pronouncing half the letters, clarified what exactly the professor meant. Vince's face was covered with veins protruding from rage. He frowned, and deep, numerous folds of skin lay between his eyebrows. On the open pale palm was a red symbol in the form of a diamond and two small rectangles. Garcia, wearing a bloody shirt and with his hand pressed to his face, coughed and again said that he could explain everything to the professor. Vince looked at the young man with hostility and clenched his blood-stained fist, asking if Garcia had thought about it thoroughly. The young man sighed heavily in pain when the professor angrily lifted him off the floor by his once white shirt. Raising Garcia to his face, Vince hissed furiously that everything had unfolded before his eyes, and now the young man was blathering an excuse with his broken mouth. The professor, with narrowed eyes, noted that Garcia was using the artifact in plain sight, and asked the young man if he hoped that Vince did not notice the use of the artifact. Garcia closed his eyes and said plaintively that he had no other way because the pride of his family was at stake. The professor bared his teeth and asked whether the young man was ultimately able to defend the honor of the family. Garcia's sweaty face contorted with sadness and regret. Vince himself answered his own question, saying that the young man did not stand for anything. The professor threw Garcia away with a slight movement of his hand, and the young man flew several meters back. While Garcia covered his face with his hands and trembled, Vince approached him and said that after class he was waiting for him in his office to assemble a teaching council, at which the young man's antics would be discussed and decisions about his punishment would be made. Theodore shuddered and tensed when the professor suddenly loudly called his name. Vince, frowning, demanded that the main character go to the professor's laboratory. Theodore was confused, but quickly accepted the professor's order. The main character stood in the research building of Bergen Academy and talked out loud about something. With frowning brows looking at the door in front of him, Theodore concluded that the time had come. The main character walked along a wide, bright corridor and scratched his head. Theodore frowned thoughtfully and touched his chin, thinking that the professor had called him to him, most likely because of his anomalous development, and besides, Vince would obviously begin to question the main character. Beads of sweat appeared on Theodore's face as he came to the conclusion that such a sudden lack of skill would raise questions in anyone, and after what happened, the young man began to be treated with suspicion. Theodore suddenly stopped and raised his head. He looked at a small, light sign that announced the nearby location of the laboratory. The main character pressed his palm to his forehead and thought with despair that he couldn't find a solution and couldn't tell the truth either. Theodore looked at gluttony in the palm of his hand and concluded that this creature could be regarded as supernatural and mistaken for black magic, and the main character would not avoid problems if gluttony was discovered. The main character mentally cursed and frowned, thinking that he still had a way out. Theodore knocked gently on the wooden door, asking the professor for permission to enter. The young man's face showed excitement when Vince's loud voice was heard from the laboratory. Theodore slowly opened the door. The professor was sitting at the table with a book in his hands and, having greeted the main character, said that he had just returned from the pedagogical council. Vince smiled softly and with a friendly gesture invited Theodore to sit down and make himself comfortable. Looking at the main character, the professor said that he was worried that Theodore would get hurt, but it couldn't be said from him that he was somehow hurt. The protagonist sat on the chair in front of Vince and listened as he said that the afternoon affair was resolved with the cooperation of the parties involved, and Earl Carter, the head of this family, personally came and apologized. The professor added that the issue was sensitive for the academy, and even the director was afraid to make a decision in the light of impending troubles, and Vince was not allowed to say a word. But in the end, the head of the Carter family personally asked for forgiveness and asked him to convey his apologies to Theodore. The professor said with a smile that that was all, and now they would get straight to business. The main character involuntarily opened his mouth when Vince suddenly took out the very artifact that Garcia had previously used. Theodore looked lost at the object in Vince's hand and hesitantly suggested that this artifact was known as the Roaring Flame. The professor frowned slightly and confirmed this, saying that the idiot Garcia had taken advantage of him. Vince said that this artifact contains the soul of Hork, a fiery coyote, and with it the user gains Hork's abilities and turns magic into fire. Vince grinned mysteriously, saying that this was a kind of apology from the Count, and such cases were rare, but Theodore could only accept it. The professor moved the artifact closer to the main character and said that this thing now belongs to him. Theodore raised one eyebrow and asked nervously if Vince was joking. The professor replied with a smile that otherwise the main character would have to deal with the issue of expulsion, and if the apology was not accepted, Vince would take care of Garcia's expulsion. Theodore put a smile on his face, sweating with worry, and said that now he had nothing more to regret. Vince quirked one eyebrow and raised his glasses higher, saying that Theodore had made a wise choice. The professor crossed his arms and silently watched as the main character examined the artifact in his hands. Suddenly Vince frowned in alarm and began fiddling with his fingers, looking at the wooden table. The professor closed his eyes and said the name of the main character. Theodore, who was putting the artifact away in his bosom, froze in fear when Vince asked him to answer one question. Looking at his intertwined fingers, the professor said that they had been together with the young man for 3 whole years, and Vince also regretted the stagnation in Theodore's skills and abilities due to various restrictions. Theodore closed his eyes and sat with his head bowed while Vince said that the main character had not so much changed since the winter holidays, but had become completely different. Theodore opened his eyes, narrowed in disbelief, when Vince said that the young man might not answer if he didn't call, because he was definitely not one of those who would start doing dirty deeds in order to improve his skills. The professor seemed to be trying with difficulty to say that, as Theodore's mentor, he was ready to provide his help wherever it was needed, but fell silent without finishing the sentence. Theodore bit his lower lip in anxiety. Vince silently watched the main character's reaction and asked him to tell everything. Theodore was lost in thought, where he tossed between confessing or lying to the professor, and concluded that sooner or later they would certainly find out about the books missing from the library, and immediately after that gluttony would be discovered. The main character came to the conclusion that after this, let alone at the academy, he would not even be able to appear on the street. The professor did not take his eyes off Theodore, patiently waiting for his answer. The main character hesitantly looked back at Vince and was silent. Then Theodore closed his eyes and said that it would be as the professor wanted it. The main character put his hand on his left shoulder and asked Vince to look at this hand. Theodore, with his eyes closed, raised his left palm, on which a small black spot could be seen. It began to spread across the palm and even go beyond it in the form of thin black smoke. Vince tensed and even began to sweat, asking Theodore what the hell this was. When black smoke passed over the protagonist's face, he calmly said without emotion that the professor should not worry and just watch. Vince watched the young man in confusion as he clenched his hand, from which more and more black substance was coming out, into a fist and ordered him to leave. The space began to fill with a bright pink glow. Theodore stood in the middle of the pink fog with black smoke and said coldly that it was time for lunch. The professor, with undisguised fear, opened his eyes wide and opened his mouth, watching what was happening, when suddenly a third voice was heard in the laboratory. Professor Vince looked at Theodore puzzled. He was shocked by what he saw. He asked his student, calling him by name, what he was doing for God's sake, and asked a clarifying question what was going on with him here. Miller stood with a calm face and looked at his professor. Dark energy emanated from gluttony, which enveloped the entire space. He glowed. Theodore noted that it was time for the gluttons to have a snack. Gluttony happily opened his mouth. Professor Zadish looked at the main character and remembered the past. Vince sat on a chair and leaned his elbows back, looking at Theodore. He then asked if Theo was the underperforming student. Theodore Miller gave a confirming response to the professor's words and said that yes, it was him. The main character closed his eyes. He noted that it doesn't matter what his grades are now, because skills play a decisive role at Virgin Academy. Vince looked at his student questioningly and calmly. Heidel noted that Theodore was wrong, and added that he did not call his student because of this. Professor Vince looked at Theodore with intrigue, leaning on his palm. He noted that his learning abilities are much better than anyone in this academy. Vince asked Miller what he thought about his words, especially that if Professor Vince began to support him, and thus he would remain at Virgin Academy. The main character couldn't believe his ears. His eyes were empty and he was lost in thought. He noted, thoughtfully, that after these words something seemed to flash in his head, because in the Virgin Academy, where everyone seemed to be his enemies. The main character released the gluttony from his hand, and his magical grimoire deftly grabbed the artifact that was lying on the professor's table with his tongue. Theodore noted that Professor Vince is someone whom he, for some unknown reason, can trust without a doubt completely. Gluttony was very pleased. He brings the artifact closer and closer to himself. Miller began to say that the artifact that is in front of his grimoire, the hand of the protagonist, where gluttony was, began to make squelching sounds. Gluttony increasingly pushed the artifact into its mouth. The professor's eyes were narrowed very tightly. He was shocked and surprised. The main character ordered Gluttony to consume the artifact with roaring flames. The professor's office was filled with pink smoke, and Miller's hand glowed like a shooting star, but the main character stood calmly. The system notified that the flame-cutting artifact had been consumed. This artifact is precious and of high quality. Gluttony chewed the artifact with heaviness. The main character stayed on his feet with all his strength. The system noted that this medallion was created using a special technique passed down in the Carter family, and added that the agreement would be concluded through a blood alliance. The system also explained that when used, the artifact temporarily increases the user's magical power and also converts it into flame magic. Pink flames emanated from Theodore after the artifact agreement. Professor Vince silently watched what was happening. Gluttony opened his mouth, causing the protagonist's hand to begin to tremble. In an instant, Miller became covered in an even greater haze, and Professor Heidel sat in complete shock. Sweat ran down his face, but he continued to look attentively at his student. Vince asked Theodore to explain everything from that moment on in as much detail as possible. Theodore sat awkwardly opposite Professor Vince and trembled while he looked at him carefully without looking away. Heidel noted that Miller ultimately wants to tell him that in his left hand there now lives a grimoire that absorbs artifacts and books that contain magic. Theodore's face was sweating. Heidel sighed, closing his eyes at the same time. The professor was serious. He noted what it meant that Miller had the greedy grimoire in his hand. Heidel crossed his arms and looked at the main character. He continued to say that the knowledge of the grimoire is unimaginable, and added that the power of the absorbed object is acquired after the bearer appreciates it, and explained that in addition, the bearer is able to master the magical abilities of the object itself. The professor asked Theodore whether he was right or wrong. Theodore lowered his head in remorse as they looked at him. Miller noted that he offers his deepest apologies. Heidel went on to say that however, since he is a professor at the academy, he cannot approve of the fact that he fed the grimoire books from their academy's library. The professor crossed his palms and placed them directly in front of his nose. He noted that, in principle, everything is in order, because for Theodore this moment was a matter of life and death for him, wasn't it? Vince asked the main character. Heidel also added that if the main character continues to stop feeding his grimoire of gluttony, then gluttony will simply completely consume its host, and noted that he is pleased with the information received, because he has completely satisfied his curiosity. Miller's hand shook a little while Professor Vince looked at him with interest. Theodore noted that he would like to ask him a question, if Mr. Heidel would not mind. Heidel looked seriously at his student as he sweated from fear of receiving a negative answer. Professor Vince noted that he believes that he has already understood what question the main character wants to ask him. Vince noted Theodore's question with a special intonation, asking himself the question in the words of his student, why he did not want to take this grimoire away from Miller, and clarified whether it was Theodore who wanted to ask. Heidel smiled. He noted that the answer to this question is very simple. Professor Vince looked arrogantly at the main character and lowered his hands onto the table. He noted that it would be difficult for him to realize this until he delved deeper into archaeology, and added that if Miller were a higher-level magician, it would not be difficult for him. Heidel noted that the grimoire in his palm, he paused for a short moment, was simply an unnecessary trinket for high-level magicians. Miller was shocked by the professor's answer and somehow pulled out the next question. He asked if gluttony was useless. Vince lowered his eyebrows with a frown. He noted that a creature such as gluttony cannot even be called a grimoire, since it is not actually even a book, and added that, therefore, it chose its owner and is parasitizing him. Heidel put his finger to his spring and calmly thought. He reasons that if you kill the owner, then at that very moment he will become a victim of this grimoire, like other foolish people in his memories, and noted that in addition, it seems that the grimoire cannot be transferred to someone else, so the best option would be to keep the owner close to you, thereby studying the grimoire. The main character silently looked at the professor. Vince noted with a smile that in any case, he was grateful to Miller for sharing this information with him, and he noted that he, Vince Heidel, as his professor, as well as his colleague the magician, would repay him in full for his trust in him. Theodore lowered his gaze and said the professor's name. Heidel smiled kindly. He asked Miller if they both should do something to build trust between each other. Theodore was very surprised by what he heard and asked the professor again. A hard aura began to emanate from Professor Vince, a keyhole appeared in place of his heart, everything was illuminated in blue hues. He sternly noted that they use a measure of limitation, an oath. The professor shouted that he was Vince Heidel and noted that he swore to himself that he would keep it a strict secret. The magical lock that was installed directly on his heart began to click into place and lit up with a bright light right on his back. He continued to shout that he would not tell anyone what Theodore Miller would not allow him to share with anyone else. Miller was shocked. He did not know what to do in such a situation. His eyes narrowed. With a stutter, Miller said the professor's name. The entire office was lit up with a bright flash, which confirmed the conclusion of this agreement. The flash gradually began to fade, and the professor sat and did not even move. The conclusion of the contract was over. Heidel breathed a sigh of relief. He noted that he thought that would be enough. Blue marks appeared on the hands of Professor Vince and Theodore, which were confirmation of their agreement. In his thoughts, Miller noted that the professor had said that phrase and carved the oath mark of his own free will, and added that all this was done for the sake of him and his secret. Miller's eyes began to water, and all for him, he noted in his thoughts. Theodore began to cry quietly, his tears streaming down his cheeks. The main character was trembling and his tears began to fall directly into his palms. The professor stood up from his seat. He walked up to the main character and put his hand on Miller's head while he cried quietly. The professor's hand gently passed over the main character's head, and he put his hand on his shoulder. Theodore sat silently, and Heidel stood next to him and smiled warmly at him. He noted that he relies on the main character and called him by his first and last name, Theodore Miller. Miller began to win with his hand the tears that did not stop flowing. He thanked his professor, and he repeated by telling him, "Thank you very much." A week has passed since then. One of the students with golden eyes stood in front of the board and wrote down her answer while holding a book in her other hand. She noted that the reason they use magic circles is very simple for stabilization, and added that their success rate would be higher, especially compared to a normal spell casting, and noted that the most effective push for this would be. Theodore sat on the bench and was bored. He leaned his head on his hand. In his thoughts, he noted that nothing special had happened because his daily life remained the same as before. Miller was writing something in his notebook with a pen. He used red ink. He noted in his thoughts that the most he had to change was that now he had to report the books he had fed to the glutton. He recalled Professor Vince's menacing gaze and a shiver ran down his spine. Theodore continued to think that thanks to Professor Vince's help, he no longer had to worry about the consequences, but he also noted that after he brought up the topic of buying artifacts on the black market, Heidel's expression changed slightly for the worse. Miller remembered Cannies, the Friends manager, who smiled sarcastically. He noted that he had heard various rumors, but he would no longer have to go to her because Professor Vince promised to provide him with everything he would need in the future. The class ended, all the students began to collect their things and leave the classroom. The main character followed their example. He mentally noted that in any case, his classes were already over and it was time for him to go to Professor Vince in the research building, and added that the state of gluttony had not yet stabilized, and therefore Miller was forced to cooperate with Professor Heidel until his graduation from the academy. Miller walked straight down the corridor. He continued to note that the minutes flew by one after another while he was thinking about all this, and added that when he reached the professor's office, he knocked on his door. Miller tapped on the door with 2 fingers. The professor noted that Theodore could come in. Theodore looked at Professor Vince in shock. He was surprised. Professor Vince stood opposite the main character and was beaming with a mug of tea in his hand. He was glad to see Theodore and noted that he had finally arrived. Miller was shocked when he saw the professor's clean desk. He asked, stuttering, whether the professor was really going to move or what was going on. Professor Vince looked at the main character with a grin, holding his hot tea, from which steam was emanating. He noted that he would like to show Theodore something. Theodore looked carefully at the object that lay in front of him. He asked, puzzled, that this was the seal of the Kingdom of Malta lying in front of him. The professor's smile grew even wider. He asked if Miller knew what was there and added that it was an invitation letter to the Kingdom's magic tournament. Heidel put one of his hands in his pocket. He spoke slyly, asking what the main character thought, why he was showing him this invitation letter. Miller narrowed his eyes and noted that this couldn't be true. Miller stood with his back bent and looked at Heidel in shock as he held his tea. Heidel noted that the main character noticed everything correctly, because the letter indicated that Vince could take part in the accompaniment of one assistant, whom he could choose himself. Professor Vince looked calmly at Miller as puffy white clouds were visible in the window in the background. He asked his student what he thought about this, and added by asking if Theodore would like to go with him to the capital of magic. Theodore looked at the letter carefully. He put his hand next to the seal. He shouted joyfully that he really wanted to go with the professor. Professor Vince carefully looked through the letter, adjusting his glasses. He noted that everything was in order, and added that even with the slightest error in the document, they were unlikely to be allowed to compete. Theodore sat opposite the professor and looked at him while he read the letter again. Miller asked how much Heidfeld thinks those people over there are picky about the design of the letter. Heidel noted that it was natural, and added that there was a risk of spies or uninvited guests entering. Professor Vince looked at Theodore carefully. He addressed him by name, calling him Theodore. Heidel began to rummage through his jacket pockets. He asked what the main character knew about why he invited him to go with him to the tournament in the Kingdom of Melter. The main character sat thoughtfully. Professor Vince continued to talk about whether he knew the old adage that ignorance is bliss is true. Heidel hit the table and noted that there are some things that are best forgotten long ago. The professor took out a book with a blue cover and held it. He noted doomedly, and now he will find out everything. Miller looked disapprovingly at the dusty book. He asked if the professor was really giving him his rules for the Burgeon Academy. The professor put his hand on the collection while Miller was in shock and he began to read the article. The professor noted that Article 38, Paragraph 12, and noted that this was about additional assessments beyond the basic qualifying exam, and added that if a student took 3rd place or higher in a tournament led by a magical society, and added that he then had the right to graduate early. Professor Vince looked at Miller with a smirk as he listened with interest. Heidel noted with full confidence that Miller should be interested in this because after spending so much time within the walls of the academy, he was probably quite bored with it, especially being here, and added that the main character didn't even have anything else to study here. Miller became worried. He awkwardly replied that he was not confident in his abilities. Professor Vince grinned and looked at him. He called the guy by name, and noted that when he first came to them, Vince immediately realized that his knowledge of theory was superior to that of any professor. Theodore sat silently and watched. Heidel noted that also, moreover, he must be going through a very difficult time right now, because after reaching the 3rd circle, he was unable to find books to move to the 4th club of the academy. Vince noted that Miller's main problem is that his sensitivity to magic was serendipitously chosen by the grimoire for gluttony. The main character looked at the floor of the office. Heidel noted that due to this, his presence in the academy is a highly controversial issue. Professor Vince recalled everything as a professor at this academy. He noted, asking if Miller remembered the people who were considered a nuisance then. He added that those professors are real beasts themselves who only recognize fame and influence and never repent of their actions. Instead, they will accept their enemies even more, Professor Theodore noted. Miller looked at the letter and skull that lay in front of him. Heidel noted that it was better for Theodore to stay away from such people and finally leave this place, and added that in the end, he himself planned to move to the capital, Vince noted. He said the sooner Miller completes his training, the sooner they will be practicing in a better location. Theodore clasped his hands together and pinched his thumbs over his nose as he thought. Miller noted that he understood what Professor Vince meant. In front of them stood a gray building that was shrouded in heavy fog. It was Melter. Professor Vince noted that it was for this reason that he wanted to take him to Melter. Theodore was embarrassed and there was doubt in his eyes. Theodore noted that in general he agreed with the professor, but he asked a clarifying question that haunted him, whether he would be able to win. Heidel smiled and put his hands in front of him. He noted that, as a rule, this is impossible. Professor Vince recalled how Miller used his gluttony in front of him, and he was enveloped in clots of dark aura. Heidel noted that the main character is an exception, and he also added that Miller is still far from Garcia. However, the professor continued to say he noted that he was sure that the main character would be able to cope with this with the magician of any quarter of the Russians in the circle, and the fact, he added, that all the participants were students would only make the task easier for them. The main character gave up his fists. He asked that it was not the Battle Mage division we were talking about now. Heidel warily recalled the participants in this division. He noted that the main character hit the mark and explained that only assistants of invited magicians can join him. Heidel noted with a grin while adjusting his glasses so that he considered this a kind of warm-up match for the professors. Professor Vince remembered Sylvia with her professor. He noted that these assistants are the same students as the main character. The main character thought. He put his finger to his lips. In his thoughts, he noted that the professor was right since there was a chance of victory. Miller recalled his outstretched hand, on which the glutton was. He noted that he received the ability to memorize when the glutton absorbed Garcia's relic a couple of days ago, and added that this dishonest ability allows him to accumulate mana, and at a certain moment, use it immediately. The hero recalled the recent night from the book. He noted that he could add to this Alfred's ability, which he received after synchronization. His experience and sensitivity were transferred to the main character. He noted that the professor probably did him this kind of favor to see the result from his last sparring. Theodore smiled and clenched his fist. He noted that he thought it was worth a try, and the professor looked at his student with a grin, his hands clasped. He noted that he would then in turn fill in some of the gaps. Professor Vince opened his locker, which contained a book with a yellow cover. Heidel took out this circle and placed it in front of him. He noted that he bought this book for 50 gold coins from a simpleton who collects original copies, and added that the search process itself was not particularly difficult, but sorting it took a lot of time. Professor Vince recalled how he recently chose a suitable copy among two books. He noted that it is quite easy to distinguish the original from the army, because the same copy cannot be made from a copy. He added that he searched everywhere and checked everything carefully. Heidel noted that he had difficulty obtaining this book, and added that he hopes that the main character will like the book. Miller furrowed his eyebrows. He was shocked. Miller cautiously asked the professor if he could evaluate this book. Professor Vince smiled and ran his hand through the air. He noted that of course it is possible, he promised him. Theodore swallowed convulsively. He said, assessment. Theodore put his hand with the Grimoire of Gluttony directly to the book. The book glowed with a bright light. Two heroes of this book appeared before Theodore, a man and a woman, fire. The system noted that there was an introduction to spirit magic, and also added that this book describes the characteristics of the four elements, their concept, principles, and how to make a contract with a spirit. The system introduced the main character to the author of this book, Miedel, and added that he was a famous elementalist who, using magic, managed to summon the ruler of the spirits. Miedel stood lighting his pipe while the perfume writer stood with him. The system noted that the class of the book is rare, and after absorbing it, the magic of the spirits in the main character will significantly increase, and the opportunity to connect oneself with the spirit will also open up. The system continued to say that this was a unique copy that was written by the author himself, and noted that there was a small chance that it would be possible to conclude a contract with the spirit. The main character frowned. He noted that connecting with the spirit was an incredible opportunity for him, and added that he thought he would never be able to do it. Miller could not believe that I could get such a wonderful specimen, a gift from Professor Vince. Heidfeld smiled. He noted that this was only the first book and asked what about the class of this book. Theodore smiled sheepishly. He noted that the class of this book is rare. Theodore stood in front of Heidel's table. They were talking to each other. Heidel noted that this means they only have 2 more such books left to find. Miller answered his question positively. Professor Vince asked him what about the second book. The professor looked at his tea, puzzled. He noted that he would obviously make every effort to search for the second book in order to find it as quickly as possible, and added that Theodore could already go today. Professor Vince started writing his hot tea. He gasped about the upcoming trip, how he remembered it, and noted that regarding the trip. He silently put down his tea while the main character bent over while getting up from his chair. Vince noted that they would leave for the capital in 3 days, and added that he should be fully prepared. Theodore Miller looked closely at Heidel. Theodore Miller repeated the professor's words and noted that in 3 days and said, "Okay." Theodore ran as fast as he could to his dorm. He ran faster and faster while the rest of the academy students looked back at him. He suddenly grabbed the door handle and opened it with a sharp movement. He ran into his room and began to greedily swallow air. Gluttony began to scream from his hand. He called the guy and talked about how hungry he was. Miller opened his palm and Gluttony began to look at him seriously. The grimoire of Gluttony answered him that if he didn't feed him right now, he would eat his bearer right here and now. Theodore began to sweat. He was unpleasant that the glutton began to run his tongue over his face. Miller noted that he understood, and asked the grimoire not to go crazy and added what would happen if they were caught because of it. Theodore took off his bag with the dog. In his thoughts, he noted that the amount of food he consumes is decreasing, but the way he demands it remains unchanged. And the main character also added that the standards of the food he requires are growing every time. They complained about gluttony to the main character while he looked at him carefully. The grimoire told him that he was very hungry, and Miller continued to note in his thoughts that the demands of gluttony and his frequency of awakening were increasing, and added that this worried him very much, but first of all, he must take care of satisfying the hunger of his grimoire. The main character smiled. He noted to the glutton that food was served. Without wasting a minute, the glutton reached out with his tongue to the book. The main character closed his eyes while the system connected his consciousness with the book, and behind the hero stood the spirits of different elements of the earth. The system noted that introduction to spirit magic had been successfully absorbed. The system added that the level of mastery of spirit magic has increased significantly. Miller was sweating. He looked straight at the glutton. In his thoughts, he noted that he was glad that he had finally acquired earth elemental magic, and added to himself that such an ability was difficult to obtain. The system reappeared. She noted that the original book had been consumed, and a request was sent to her to connect with Mädel Herser. The main character was very surprised. His eyes narrowed. He repeated with horror, "Connection." A huge number of hands appeared in front of the main character, reaching out to him. The system noted that the connection was waiting. After waiting a little, it said that the connection had been successfully established. The connection with the elementalist Mädel Cruiser was approved. The main character said, puzzled, "What is this?" Hands grabbed Miller and began to drag him down while he screamed for you to stop. They took him to another dimension and threw him down. He screamed in horror and flight. His eyes began to water. He looked straight. The main character fell lower and lower through a bunch of clouds. He asked himself in horror where he had ended up. Mädel sat calmly and smiled. In an instant, the main character fell next to him right into the snow, and he looked at him. Mädel grinned and looked carefully at the main character. He noted with a cigarette in his mouth that he seemed to have a visitor. The system noted that the connection was started. The main character, lying with a wet face, held his head and sighed heavily. Theodore saw 2 large ice blocks, between which thin red ribbons stretched, and asked out loud where he was. The main character sat down and began to rub the top of his head, thinking that he had definitely heard something about the connection. But Theodore did not think that he was immersed, as usually happens during the synchronization process. The main character covered half of his face with his palm, and his gaze looked lost. Theodore raised his head and looked at the huge ice blocks towering above him. The protagonist furrowed his thin black eyebrows, upset at how high the surface was. Suddenly, the blonde, bearded man with a black eye patch smiled as he saw Theodore finally wake up. The main character tensed when the stranger said that everything had collapsed from above, and he thought that a star had fallen from heaven, but it turns out that it was Theodore who fell here. Puzzle appeared on the protagonist's face, and he lostly repeated the man's last words. Suddenly, Theodore's dark eyes widened in shock, and he fixed his gaze on the stranger. The man looked at the young man with one yellow eye and concluded that he knew about his identity. But Theodore was clearly not an ordinary guest who came for something simple. The stranger, sitting cross-legged and holding a plate of something hot in his hand, smiled and introduced himself as the spirit Mädel Hersheim and suggested that Theodore would not be surprised by this information. The main character, placing one hand on his bent knee, asked if he was in the place of personal imprisonment of the spirit. Merdala grinned and, raising the plate to his face, explained that previously the places of imprisonment were called the territory of the dispossessed. The man said that this place was used during battles, when exhausted warriors wanted to calm the souls of their fallen comrades, and this is where their souls remain, isolating themselves from the whole world. Mädel closed his only eye and said that the fact that a person had discovered this place was truly something out of the ordinary. Theodore closed his eyes and honestly answered that he did not know whether this place was special or not, because he was called here by some unknown force and did not even expect to meet a spirit in this place. Mädel straightened his green robe, concluding that the main character seemed to have been dragged here by force, and wanted to return to the reason for the young man's presence here. Theodore, looking at his open palm, replied that he was indeed sent here by some force. However, this time everything is not so simple because it was the first time he was summoned. The spirit clarified whether an unknown force appeared out of nowhere under strange circumstances, and Theodore hesitated, but said that the man was unlikely to believe him if he told him. Mädel let out a short laugh, without taking his eyes off his interlocutor. Then the man broke into a smile and, humming thoughtfully, said that Theodore probably had his own worries. The spirit said that right before the main character appeared, the man felt a response and came to the conclusion that someone was planning to come for the young man. Mädel took a sip from a small orange plate and said that first of all he needed to make sure of something. Theodore looked at the spirit warily, frowning. Meadle exhaled with a smile, and a huge creature with red eyes and mouth appeared behind him. The spirit furrowed his brows and ordered Theodore to look him straight in the eyes. The main character looked at Meadle with fear. The spirit approached the frightened protagonist and concluded with a smile that there was definitely no fire in his gaze, and Theodore did not know how to rage like a flame. Meadle added that Theodore avoids spontaneous combustion and does not enjoy reckless things, so the spirit of fire is not suitable for him. The main character listened silently as Meadle said that the young man is not free like the wind and not as flexible as water. Meadle grinned and concluded that Theodore was a completely uninteresting person. The spirit added that, however, there is nothing wrong with not standing out. The main character, overcoming surprise and fear, asked what this meant. Meadle bared his teeth, and the creature behind him laughed deafeningly, crossing his muscular arms. The spirit asked with a grin if Theodore could guess by looking at the guy's reaction behind him. The main character frowned and closed his eyes while Meadle said that the young man, like no one else, knows what perseverance is, and that nothing can shake the stability of the earth, be it fire, wind, or water. Meadle ran his index finger along the ground, leaving behind a stripe on it. The spirit drew 3 lines on the ground and said that Theodore is like the earth. Pouring the contents of the plate onto the surface of the earth, Meadle concluded that the main character is honest, but tough, and he can be called a strong person. Theodore frowned thoughtfully, looking at the ground. The main character opened his mouth in shock when ice blocks suddenly split and flew in the air. The space lit up as the ice formed a hole from which small ice shards spilled out. Suddenly, a pale female face appeared. The girl opened her light yellow eyes. She had long blonde hair, pointed ears, and a long white suit that matched her skin color, with a bright blue necklace hanging around her neck. The girl quickly flew down. Then she got tangled in her long hair and began to fall upside down, and her body became significantly smaller. Theodore caught in his palm a miniature creature wearing a blue scarf and loose white clothes. The main character looked at the girl in his palms with disbelief and asked if she was really the one who is called the spirits of the earth. The girls opened one bright yellow eye and extended a small palm towards Theodore. The girl, who had 2 sharp horns growing from her forehead, touched the protagonist's thumb with her palm. Theodore even blushed and noted to himself how cute she was. Meadle grinned and introduced this spirit as Mithra and said that she liked the main character. The man said that Mithra was one of the forgotten ancient spirits of the earth, and suggested that the response he heard earlier was precisely from her. When the shocked Theodore asked if Mithra was too small, Meadle said with a grin that one should never judge a spirit by its appearance. The man explained with a smile that now Theodore, as a guide, must awaken Mithra's true power, and he will be lucky enough to see her true essence if he manages to grow with her. When Meadle put a black cauldron on the fire and invited Theodore to also have a snack, the young man let out a short laugh and said that he needed to return to where he came from. Meadle persistently handed the main character a dish and said that nothing bad would happen if he ate one plate before leaving. Mithra became interested when Theodore picked up the plate with slight disbelief and said that it wasn't such a bad idea. The main character was looking into a plate filled with liquid when he suddenly saw 2 long black hands in the reflection. Theodore, baring his teeth and frowning, turned around sharply. The main character screamed deafeningly as a multitude of long black limbs grabbed him by the shirt and lifted him into the air. Meadle raised his head with a plate and spoon in his hands, silently watching what was happening. The man smiled and raised the spoon to his mouth, saying that he was looking forward to the events to come. While Theodore was being dragged away by dozens of hands, Meadle wondered if the young man's visit had something to do with the power in his left hand, whom the man met a long time ago. The system reported that the connection with Meadle had been completed. Theodore lay with his hand on his head, sighing heavily through clenched teeth. The main character, who had Mithra lying on his stomach, complained out loud. Theodore then turned his gaze to the spirit of the earth. Looking at the sleeping Mithra, the main character thought that the power of her presence during the call was felt so strongly, as if the king of spirits was in front of the young man, although now she is small, like a child. Theodore covered his eyes with his hand and cursed out loud, smiling at the same time. The main character was glad that he had a chance to win the tournament, because now he had made a contract with the spirit. Birds circled high in the air above the palace towers. Theodore was sweating and breathing heavily because he was carrying huge luggage on his back. The main character, dressed in a long dark cloak, exhaled tiredly and stopped, and 2 more large suitcases stood at his feet. 3 days later, at the academy gates, Theodore was dragging his backpack, growling with exertion and dripping with sweat. The main character thought that he wanted to take a few things, but due to the need to feed gluttony, he had to carry a large number of books. Vince silently watched as Theodore, who was not visible behind a huge backpack, said that it was necessary to hire a crew because it was very difficult for him. The professor approached the young man and asked with a smile why he needed so many things, but Theodore did not answer. The main character put on a weak smile and said that he took a little more than necessary, and most of the luggage consisted of food for gluttony. Vince grinned and said that he expected something like this, so he prepared in advance. Theodore raised one eyebrow at the professor and asked how exactly he had prepared. In response, Vince just silently opened a white bag, from which came a bright blue glow. The professor explained that this is not just a bag, but an artifact, which is a spatial pocket, and they may need it for a long journey. Theodore tensed and remembered that Vince had something similar in his collection, and the young man had heard about this artifact, but it looked strange. The professor noticed the reaction of the main character and, with a raised eyebrow and a grin, told him not to look at this artifact with such a face. Theodore froze, eyes wide with fear, when Vince said that this artifact was very convenient, and placed all the young man's luggage in it. The professor tied the bag tightly with a rope. When Vince told Theodore to take off his backpack and put it on the ground to place it in the spatial pocket, the main character looked at the professor with horror. City of Bergen. Vince and Theodore walked through thin streets filled with people in red cloaks. The main character looked with disgust at the octopuses lying in someone's cart. Vince raised one eyebrow and turned when Theodore said he wanted to ask him a question. The main character said that there are only 9 days before the start of the magic tournament, and there is still a month to go to Manhavilla, and you may not be able to get there on time. The professor turned around and replied with a grin that he should not worry about it, for they were not the only ones heading to Manhaville now. Vince said that of all the people who now go to the capital, there are those who value this season the most. Theodore assumed that the professor was talking about merchants. Vince smiled and explained that in addition to the main roads, there are also quite risky ones, called trade routes, and such a route saves a lot of time, and the dangers can be eliminated with the help of money. Vince said that he had traveled like this a couple of times in the old days, and it was better not to go there alone. The professor said that it was full of bandits and monsters. Vince concluded that this route would take them to the capital 3 times faster, and they could ensure their protection by teaming up with the merchants. Theodore closed his eyes and said with irritation that the cost was worth it, and Vince agreed with a smile. Suddenly, the professor's gaze became attentive and cold. As they approached the tall white building, Vince concluded that they were there and that this was the group of merchants they would be joining. A blonde girl with her hair tied up was talking to a man in glasses who was flipping through sheets of paper on a tablet. While the professor and the main character were going down the stairs, the girl asked why they were so late. Anna Farrell, head of the second largest merchant guild in Bergen, greeted Vince happily and said that she had been waiting for him. When Theodore asked with horror whether he was married, the professor broke out in sweat and told him not to even ask about it. The main character widened his eyes and opened his mouth when Anna almost swept the professor off his feet, hugging him tightly. Theodore turned away in disgust when Anna, sitting on Vince, trembled about how much she missed her, and the professor politely asked the girl to get off. Looking at the joyful and loving Anna and Vince standing next to her, Theodore assumed that Vince was confused, just like the main character when he was first left for the second year. Anna narrowed her eyes at Theodore and asked Vince who was with him. The professor apologized and introduced Anna and Theodore to each other. Vince noted that Gordon did not appear in person and suggested that Anna would perform his duties this time. The girl immediately confirmed this. Anna said that a couple of days ago Gordon said that he was tired of the face of his wife and daughter, took a fishing rod and left home, leaving only a note with the words "I'll be back in 2 months." Theodore's face froze in horror. Vince laughed awkwardly and said that the situation was so-so, but Anna said that her father had done a lot before he left, so his disappearance did not affect anything. The professor asked Anna where the crew intended for them was. Vince froze with an expression of awkwardness on his face when Anna approached him and with a playful smile replied that she had prepared a carriage just suitable for a magician of the 5th circle, spacious, with all amenities and a shower. The girl was flirting with Vince and did not notice how an angry man in glasses was approaching her. The stranger appeared even closer, while Anna said with a smile that this carriage was just designed for 2 people. The girl wanted to say something else when suddenly a man's hand in a brown glove came to her face. The man in glasses, with whom Anna had previously spoken, grabbed the wrong collar of the shirt and dragged her along, angrily saying that the girl urgently needed to check her accommodation details, whether she wanted it or not. Anna struggled and screamed, hinting that she might fire her subordinate. But he did not stop and replied that he would then go fishing with the severance pay that he would receive after his dismissal. The man loudly turned to Vince and said that their car was the 3rd in a row, and they were leaving soon. Both the professor and the main character stood with sweaty faces, but there was shame on Vince's face and embarrassment on Theodore's face. A large wooden door with a metal frame opened loudly. Theodore saw a spacious red room and said that it was better than he expected. Vince explained that this was a simple principle of using spatial magic, and that the traders also enchanted the horses so that they would not feel tired. The professor sat down with a sigh and asked if Theodore was tired, like himself. The main character smiled and replied that Vince's condition seemed to be much worse than his. The professor said that he just wanted to ask Theodore something after he took a little rest. The main character tensed. The professor asked Theodore to show the spirit with whom he made a contract before they set off. Vince looked at the student with interest in his eyes. Theodore opened his eyes wide and froze, thinking that lately the professor's facial expressions were more lively than ever, and any curiosity was noticeable in his gaze, which made Vince more human. Earth began to appear in Theodore's palm as he replied with a smile that, after all, it was thanks to the professor that he had entered into this contract. Vince took out a notepad and pen, announcing his readiness and asking the main character to summon the spirit. The handful of earth in the young man's hands began to shine as he loudly ordered Mithra to come out. Among the small fragments of stones, Mithra appeared, who, with her eyes closed, spread her arms to the sides. Vince opened his mouth in shock and even adjusted his glasses when he saw the spirit of the earth. While Theodore introduced the ancient spirit of the earth to the professor, Mithra sleepily looked at Vince. When the professor asked if he could talk to Mithra, Theodore replied that he tried to do so, but all he heard was more like a puppy whining, since she was still a small child. Vince arched one eyebrow and pressed his palm to his face, thoughtfully saying that this was an ancient spirit after all. The professor frowned and turned his green eyes to the student. Theodore's face showed fear mixed with bewilderment when Vince began to ask whether the young man knew the differences between simple and ancient spirits. Mithra held onto the protagonist's shoulder while a stream of saliva flowed from her open mouth. Vince held a small book in his hands and said that the difference between ancient and ordinary spirits is the presence or absence of self-awareness. While Mithra's scarf fluttered in the air, Theodore looked at the professor with a puzzled brow. Vince put his head on his hands, which he rested on his knees, and said that there were many cases where ordinary spirits, even high-ranking ones, communicated with their guides like robots. The main character put the spirit in his bosom and asked if this means that one day he will ever be able to talk to Mithra. Mithra's face showed indignation while Vince said that being able to communicate and behave as the spirit pleases are two different things, and, as a rule, a spirit called into this world does not have self-awareness, and its powers are limited. While Mithra screamed at Theodore, the professor explained that spirits like the one he made a contract with are significantly different, and Mithra has a will of her own, even though she belongs to the main character. Looking with fear at Mithra, who was baring her teeth with anger, Theodore said that she was quite often self-willed. Vince said with a smile that Mithra also has potential for development. While Theodore defended himself from the spirit, Vince drew Mithra in a notebook and said that the ancient spirits will evolve along with their guides, and the professor looks forward to the day when Mithra will stand next to the great magician shoulder to shoulder. Vince slammed the notebook shut with one hand with a loud sound, tearing off Mithra, who was clinging to Theodore's mouth with her palm. The young man said that that's enough for today. Vince lay down on the bed and said that Theodore, who was constantly being attacked by Mithra, had better get some sleep too, because they were leaving soon and it was already getting dark. The professor turned away and took off his glasses, saying that he and the student would see each other in the morning. Above the green forest, a bright disk of a yellow moon shone in the dark sky, and blackbirds were flying. Trade caravans rode in 2 rows. The birds hunted, grabbing their prey in their clawed paws. Suddenly, one of the birds dropped from its paw a small round object with an orange substance inside. It quickly fell onto the carriages. An army of sharp-eared warriors in armor and weapons in their hands noticed a sparkle in the air. One of the warriors extended his hand with long sharp nails towards the falling object. His hand clenched into a fist, as if he had caught something. The next moment, a fiery explosion occurred, breaking the wooden carts and causing them to fly apart. The forest burst into flames, and someone screamed loudly, warning of the alarm. A short space from the explosion formed in the ground, with a fire burning in the center. A man in light clothes, a dark headdress and with a bloody face swore loudly, not understanding what was happening. The man did not finish his sentence, because he fell silent when he opened his eyes and saw something terrifying above him. He saw a huge crowd of armed goblins, in the center of which stood the tallest of them and spoke in an unknown language.